My mothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Today, inshallah, is our 8th lecture in the series which we have titled Building a Peaceful Home. And before we go on to the topic for today, just a few housekeeping notes. This will be our final lecture in this series. We will, inshallah, continue with the subject in different places, and I'll try my best to upload them online so that those of you who want, you can carry on. We talked about a little bit about continuing the learning. There were actually quite a few questions that needed to be answered today. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but a couple were quite important. First of all, we mentioned that, we said that the blueprint of intimacy that our children get is from our relationships, right? So the question that came up was, what if you don't have a good blueprint? What if you've had a very shaky upbringing yourself, and what do you do, right? And what if there's been several generations of that? So, the thing is that the fact that we're sitting here and we're discussing it is a huge protective factor. Because in Islam, by the way, we are not bound by our past. We have so many, people who came to the faith. Can you imagine what baggages they came with, right? And yet they were they became the closest companions. Their past did not determine their future. So just like that, no matter where we began and no matter what baggage we carry, Allah has given us the concept of free will. He has given us the idea that we can choose our future even though we may not be able to choose our past. So the first thing it starts with is self-awareness. If we're aware that, we don't have a good role model to follow, we are learning. This is exactly what we've done. All of these days that we've talked about, if we had everything in place, then we wouldn't need these conversations, right? The fact of having these conversations is to become aware of the deficits and actually work on them intentionally. Does that make sense? So again, there's a lot of hope. A lot of people talk about the distress of marriages today, but I always look at the fact that there is a lot of hope because there's a lot of information and knowledge about what makes relationships work. So there is absolutely no reason why we can carry on the distress. Okay? So that's the first question. The second question requires a little bit of a longer answer, and it's related to what we were talking about. So we were talking about emotion contagion yesterday. Remember the fact that that we can catch emotions from other people, and the way, we talked actually a lot about how when we start off harsh, when we have criticism and contempt and stonewalling and defensiveness, all of these things pollute the emotional environment, especially when we refuse to make repairs. So even in the middle of conflict, if somebody is offering us an olive branch, if we don't take it, or if we don't offer any, or then what happens is we become flooded, we become emotionally hijacked, and we are not able to have a rational conversation. And what happens if this consistently continues is that we form, the climate of the home gets polluted and people have bad memories associated with their loved ones. And that's when we get into real trouble, right? So the question is very related. It is that I live with others or regularly interact with others. So this could be extended family who I have no control over. Some of the people that I interact with are very negative, and how can I prevent their negative energy from sapping mine and remaining positive? So I thought this was a valuable question to answer because it comes up quite often, and many of us know people like that, right? So even when we're working on ourselves, we may come across people who obviously haven't had access to the same content, or who are not at the same space in their lives where they are actually taking charge, okay? So what do we do? This is a very long topic, by the way, so I try to be as brief as possible, but know that there are many resources available, to answer this question. The first thing is that you need to prepare beforehand. So imagine that there is somebody from your extended family who, and the answer, by the way, at least the way I see it, is never to cut off relationships, because in our faith, that's not an option. Okay, let's be very clear. So whatever Facebook might tell us, walk away and, protect your boundaries and don't let negative energy into your life, that I believe is not the right way to go. So what do? We need to prepare beforehand. What that means is that we need to set an intention. So say for example, you are going to be going to a place where you know that there are some people there who will be interacting negatively. They may be just, in a place in their lives where they are distressed and they're complaining a lot, or they're just very critical of you. It could be personal or it could be just general, right? So what do you do? If you prepare beforehand and actually set an intention of how do you want to show up, what are the values how you want to live and what you want your life to be about. It's actually a really important thing to remind yourself before you go in. What happens is generally in life we are on the receiving end. We are always on the defensive. Generally before we know it, somebody calls and it's that person and now we're not prepared. So now we all have phone IDs. The first time the phone rings, you can still take a couple of deep breaths, remind yourself of your intention, and then answer the phone. Or just call them right back. Prepare yourself is what I'm saying. Secondly, this is, it's called body work, but you can look this up online. There's something called power poses. So power poses is something, just to give you a very brief idea, that how we hold our body impacts our emotions. So if I just stand straight and I imagine that my feet are growing roots in the ground and I ground myself, center myself, take a couple of deep breaths, just get in touch with what's going on inside, it can help a lot. Because again, what are you doing? You are playing offensive right now. You're not defensive, okay? So the third thing is do a personal check-in. And a very short way to remember this is HALT. H-A-L-T, hungry, angry, lonely or tired. Are you any of these things? If you are, just give yourself a little bit of love before you engage with anyone else, right? Because the idea is that if you don't fill yourself up, you cannot pour water from an empty jug. If you are continuously depleted, it will be very hard for you to live your best self, whether it's with your family, your children, or with anyone else, okay? So just do a check-in. And the idea is even when we recognize what's going on. So if I check in and say, you know what, I'm just feeling a bit lonely today. If I can name that emotion, and I don't have to do anything else. I can just name it and let it go. It's not I don't have to get into a big therapy session or anything like that. Literally naming what I'm feeling, again, it makes us conscious of what we're going through, okay? The fourth step is practice self-care. This is very related. So if I'm not looking after myself, how can I be there for others? If I don't look after the way I sleep, the way I eat, the way I love myself, the way I love others. This is a very important part of self-growth, okay? And this is something, we've only just recently started talking about. So many of us have actually no training on how to do this. And again, related to that is self-compassion, which means what? That know your limits. This is, very often what we hear from the member is we should be like this, we should be like this. We should be generous, we should be forgiving, right? The idea is it creates an internal storm. Because what I'm going through is resentment, number one. Then I'm telling myself I shouldn't be resentful. So now I am feeling awful, then I'm beating myself up for it. So how is that helping me? It's not. Very often it creates an internal storm, right? So instead of beating yourself up, just recognize that this is hard. If you just acknowledge that what you are going through is challenging, sometimes we think that just by doing that, we actually means we've defeated or we're not being a good Muslim. It doesn't mean any of that. It really doesn't. So a very quick way to do it is put your hand on your heart. We can all do it right now. Just put your hand on your heart, take a couple of breaths, and just intend goodwill to yourself. It's literally as simple as that. Okay? And then, of course, prayer is extremely important. Very often we pray that the outside circumstances change. And in my experience, that is a much more challenging thing than praying for strength to deal with those challenges. And there's many things, my personal favorites when I feel a lack of love towards people is Ya Wadudu. We'll inshallah discuss that at some other time. But also Ya Jawado, the generous. And if we think of generosity just in generosity of material things. that there's a big concept called generosity of spirit, not getting so easily triggered, right? To give people the benefit of the doubt, to have compassion for them. And again, talking about compassion, we can't really have compassion if we don't have compassion for ourselves. So it's okay to have compassion. That's how you build the muscles for compassion, you know. Um, so hopefully this will help. It's a really, really quick, summary. And inshallah, if Allah gives us the tawfiq and the life, we will, revisit it at some time, at some point in much more detail. Salah. So our topic for today is the second part of what we were talking yesterday. We talked about the fact that if we pollute the home environment, then it becomes very challenging to build a peaceful home, right? And today, inshallah, let's develop that idea a little bit more. The idea is that if we only deal with conflict, and if we're only focused on what not to do, it's still not enough. Why? What happens is if you're only focused on, okay, I must not fight, I must not say the negative thing, I must not criticize, you're not going to say anything, right? You can still be living in the same home and have no conflict and have no connection. So the idea is not only to reduce conflict, but it is also to improve connection. Because very often what happens is that if we don't do that, if we don't make a positive attempt to build that environment of a peaceful home, of a positive environment, then we will be roommates sharing a house. Then no longer is it a family and it's a home, right? So we talked about that when we're talking about an emotional climate, we are talking about the climate that people relate in, that people are engaging in, right? And the tone of the climate is set by the leaders. So, for example, if you're in a workplace, your boss makes a big difference, doesn't it? Because if your boss is a bit of a, to use an Urdu word, kharus, it's quite challenging to be positive all the time, right? Because they are setting the tone for the organization. So similarly, how we engage and relate as parents, we are the leaders of the home. So how we relate to each other and how we relate to that is what sets the climate. And just like, creating a good organization isn't a matter of chance. You actually need to be intentional. You have to think about what to do and then do it. Then, the same thing works in a family as well. Now, the reason again why this is so important is because there are three huge social trends taking place which are extremely challenging to build this environment in. The first thing is social isolation. So many people we know are living on their own, especially older people, and they are disconnected from society, right? Then there is loneliness. Loneliness can be, it doesn't mean that you're not connected to people, it means that you are not satisfied with your social connections. Loneliness, by the way, is such a huge problem in this day and age that, I think it's Britain who actually has a minister for loneliness or something like that. Because what research is now finding that human connections really count for a lot of longevity, health, mental health, emotional health, all of these things. And lack of these things is now they're saying worse than cigarette smoking, okay? So it is important. Now, what is the problem? That people can be physically close, but psychologically absent. Do you know what I'm talking about? What is causing that? What's the number one thing that's causing that? Technology, right? The telephones, and unless and until we do not learn to tame technology, it is going to be extremely challenging, because very often we are a group of people sitting in the same room, but we are connected to everyone except those who are next to us. And believe me, the need for human connection, we've talked a lot about it, so I won't repeat that. The idea is that the need for connection doesn't go away. So you're going to do it however else. If you cannot connect with someone next to you, the phone is a very easy way. And that's what makes it so dangerous. That it fills a gap, but it is so easy. And now it becomes the default mechanism by how people entertain themselves. So until and unless we don't learn to tame that part of it, it's going to be extremely hard. By the way, connecting with other people online is not the worst thing on the world, but it's not complete, and therefore it will never satisfy that need for human connection. Because when you're texting, for example, phone conversations are already one removed, right? Because you don't have body language, you don't have the presence. In relationships, there is a concept called the space between. The space between means it's the energy between you and me. It's not something that you can see or touch, but you can certainly feel it, right? And it's a lot to do related with your bank balance, with your emotional bank account and all of that, okay? So you cannot do that online, and you certainly can't do that via text. And when, so the more removed you are from the human being, now without the telephone, you've also lost the tone of voice. Now we know that words only mean, it's a very small part of communication, and I'm sure that's going to be revisited at some point. Because in the old days, they used to say words account for 7% of communication, right? Given that now we are spending, especially the youth, they don't even phone anymore. It's only text and thing, right? So we will have to revisit it and see, how it's impacted. And the thing with media is that it's still so new that the research is only just coming out. It's only just coming out, and there's now very good books, by the way. A really good book is called Alone Together by Shirley Turkle, and she also has a TED Talk. She really talks about how we expect much more from our technology today and much less from each other. Okay? So what's the third thing? The third thing is the pursuit of individualism. And this is again related to, the social trends. And the pursuit of individualism is that I can, I can work on myself, I can become good, I can do everything else. It's the idea of autonomy. Now, this is well and good, but remember, Allah did not create us to either be alone or live alone. We grow the most when we're in relationship. And especially in our faith, right? It's a faith which discourages monasticism. We are always encouraged to first work on ourselves, but then we try those by connecting to each other. What's the solution? Again, can we do anything about technology directly? Not really. Can we do anything about social isolation, loneliness? We can begin working at home on our families, right? That is some place where we do have some say. And the idea is, again, if we create that safe haven at home, if we create a place where connections can grow, where we can foster connection, then we have one more protective factor. Remember, there's no guarantees in life, right? There are risk factors and protective factors. If we create the safe base, then there is a lot of protective factors that we have in our thing. So today, inshallah, what we're going to be talking about is the importance of rituals and traditions. What do I mean by that? So very often when I'm saying rituals, what do you first think of? Sorry? Celebrations or whatever. What else? What do you think when I talk about rituals? Very often we think of it as in a negative term, right? In the sense that we're doing religious rituals, but we're not thinking about it, right? We often say don't ritualize it, have intention, and at least that's how I had very often heard it, right? But that's not what we're talking about. A ritual is basically something which is intentional, repeated, consistent, and coordinated. So let's take some examples. I have a morning ritual that when I go down to make my tea in the morning, I will make sure that the table is laid, that the kitchen is like unload the dish, things like that, right? That's like a personal ritual. Now it's a routine more than a ritual. Why? Because it doesn't have personal meaning to me as such. However, my morning cup of tea does. It's a ritual. Why? Because it means a lot of things to me. Like it's my day, for personal reflection and gratitude and all of that before I engage with the world. It's my private time, so to speak. Okay. So again, a ritual is not something, it's something that you do repeatedly again and again, but it has to mean something as well. It has to have meaning. So the importance of rituals in strengthening a family. It adds some measure of predictability. So if you walk into a house and you know that the family eats at 6 o'clock, that's their ritual, that's their daily ritual, that's a sense of predictability. So everyone knows where they will be at 6 p.m. Does that make sense? It gives you a very big opportunity for connection, and we'll talk about how. It gives you a sense of identity. So again, what does that mean? When the kids were living at home, one of our weekly rituals was that we would have Saturday brunch. Like, we would eat together pretty much every night of the week. But on Saturday, we couldn't have breakfast because none of us were that organized in the morning. But Saturdays, it would be a big deal. Like, it would be a big breakfast, and it was always followed by waffles. Okay, so that was the ritual. Now, how did we know that it meant something? Is when we stopped doing it, people would complain. That where is the waffle, or why are we not eating breakfast, or, what's happening. So in other words, a ritual is really a family ritual. If when you don't do it, you miss it. There's something missing. And it is an opportunity to enact your values. So in other words, if family connection is important to you, but you don't really spend too much time as a family, then you're not really living your values, right? So a ritual is an opportunity to do that. Now, we all have rituals, all of us do, in our families. And today will, mostly be about reminding ourselves of why this is important to keep going, why we need to persist. So, I really get that I'm speaking to a choir of the converted here, right? We're not going to be discussing anything new. But, the way you celebrate birthdays, the way you celebrate, deal on the weekend, what you do on a daily basis, all of those. We have community rituals. So, for example, Muharram is a huge community ritual, right? What you do, how you celebrate it, how you commemorate Ashura. Now, again, there is not a set way to commemorate any of these things, but each family has their own meaning. And when that is missing, like, when your kids leave home, many of them will miss that when they are not there. And that's when you know that that is something that, connected as a family. Okay. Let's talk about some of the rituals which have been recommended for us and which are really good ways to create this kind of emotional climate, right? First of all, we need to start the day right. So what research tells us is that there are certain times in the day which are very, very predictive of how the rest of the day is going to go. So morning, very important. Evening, like before you go to bed, very important. And how you greet each other and how you take leave from each other, extremely important. So these are key moments in the day when there are opportunities to build connection. So what do I mean by that? So first of all, how do you start the day? Now I'm talking about us personally, right? Sometimes we wake up in not such a pleasant mood. We haven't slept properly or whatever. It's a good idea to literally check in with yourself before you leave the bed. Do a little bit of gratitude, do a little bit of self-compassion, whatever. Because there is, Imam Ali alayhi salam said that instinctively, right? If people are pleasant to be with, we are drawn towards them. And similarly with our family, if we are upbeat, positive, and we can only do that if we actually feel it. There's only so long you can fake it, right? Some days you might have to, but most days you really need to feel it in order to. So there's another beautiful narration about positive thinking. Right? This is reported from Nabi Isa alayhi salam, where he passed by a carcass of a dog, right? And all his disciples said, that really smells bad. And he said, but look at how white his teeth are. Right? So I think that's such a beautiful example of it depends on where you place your attention. It honestly depends on where you place your attention. So we've talked about this before, right? That when we are stressed, or say if I have pain in my knee, human nature is that when I wake up, my attention will go to the pain in the knee, right? Yeah. And if I'm intentional about it and I want to be a positive impact in this world, I'll actually focus on all the other joints that are pain-free. Because even when my knees are paining, there are many parts of my body which are not. and depends on where I place my attention, right? The second point is the importance, like I said, of greetings and taking leave. So, what are we supposed to do when we enter a home? Salam, right? And it is such a highly recommended act. Again, if we make it more intentional, then literally our lives will change. So there's a narration from the Prophet ﷺ. I swear to Allah in whose hand my life is, that you cannot attain heaven and eternal happiness unless you have faith. And you cannot have faith unless you love each other. Should I not guide you towards some task, as a result of which love and friendship will be created amongst you? They answered, yes, O Prophet of Allah. He said, so salute each other with peace openly and clearly. Did we know how important it is? So even when we are saying salam, right, we say it so automatically, salam alaikum, salam alaikum. All of us do it, right? If we just take a millisecond to actually feel the peace in our heart before we wish others peace. This is what the Prophet is saying, that it will be a cause of peace in our homes and in ourselves, right? So the idea is that when you are entering the home, you are setting the tone for the rest of the evening, okay? So two things to remember. When, and I've written about this before, some of you may have read it, it's called the trouble tree. Does anyone remember what the trouble tree is? So this is a story I came across many years ago, that before you enter the home, imagine that there is a tree outside your house. And it could be a real tree or an imaginary tree, right? So somebody was actually asked that how come whenever you come home, you don't bring the stresses of the outside world inside? Like you always come home in such a cheerful mood. And he said, it's because I hang my troubles on the trouble tree. And he said, well, what is the trouble tree? And he said, well, there's this tree outside my home. So before I enter the door and visit my family, I make sure that all my troubles are hung on the tree. And then what happens is, so then, I'm going in clean, I'm going in peaceful, I'm saying salam, and I mean it. When I am leaving the next morning, I can always pick up those troubles again because they don't belong in the home. But the funny thing is that when I go to pick them up the next morning, they seem to be much smaller than they were.
Sleeping you become here.
Right? So isn't that a beautiful example? And it's something so concrete we can do with our minds, right? Literally have a trouble tree. The second thing is what we call a stress-reducing conversation. So stress-reducing conversation is a very important part of family relationships. It is when you come home and if you share parts of your day that have, caused you stress or whatever, just talk about your day for a bit. It actually causes you to relax and be at peace and be able to engage the rest of the evening in a more empathic way with others, right? Now, this seemed to be a very modern idea, but there's a beautiful story from the Prophet ﷺ where when a companion came to him and he was actually praising his wife a lot. And he said, when I come home, all my troubles go away because when I look at my wife, she is smiling, she is happy. And when I tell her my troubles for the day, she tells me, if your troubles are for the world, that know that everything is in Allah's hand. And if your troubles are, for God, then please increase them because you need to work more at it, right? So when I see her and when I hear these words, everything seems better and all my troubles seem to go away. And the Prophet tells him that indeed your wife has achieved half the status of a martyr for doing this, right? So again, the idea of a stress-reducing conversation, that when we come in and we engage with each other, sometimes what happens is that if somebody comes and they're telling us, what has gone wrong in the day, the number one thing to remember is don't side with the enemy. So what that means is that if I am coming home and I say, I had a run-in with somebody and, they said this and I said this and my spouse or any member of my family tells me, but you should have done this. Or, you have a habit of overreacting or something. Is that going to be stress-reducing for me then? No. So similarly, if our spouses are telling us that they've had a hard time at work, that's not the time to tell them that they need to manage their time better. That's not the time to tell them that, their boss is right or whatever, right? Don't side with the enemy. The stress reducing conversation means you simply validate their experience. That's all. You simply listen to them and say, die. I don't know if people understand what die means. but it just means, okay, it's okay kind of thing, right? Just listen if you don't want to do anything else. So, again, there's lots and lots of hadiths about salams, right? But let's move on. Eating together. So, the idea is when we're talking about institutionalizing or making rituals, we are not, I really get that all of us have very busy lives. And if I tell you, you need to spend 2 hours doing this, that, and the other, you're not going to do it, and neither am I, right? The idea is that we make whatever we're doing already more powerful. So it's not about finding more time, it is literally changing our intention and the consciousness with which we do things, okay? So eating together. When a believer sits together with his family for meals and eats them, for every bite he takes, he gets the reward of freeing one slave, the reward of building a city in heaven, and Allah will place all his deeds in his right hand, as in he will make him amongst the Ashab-e Yameen. There is another hadith which says, from the Prophet ﷺ, it says, that woman who loves and enjoys sitting with his children during meal times, from beneath the arsh an angel calls out, O servant of Allah, please keep on repeating this act as Allah has forgiven all your sins. That is how recommended it is to eat with the family. Now, some research on the importance of the family meal. It is, if you were to do one thing different in your family, and if you are not eating together regularly, device-free, like if that's not a thing, this would be where you would gain the most bang for your buck, so to speak, right? This is where, so many of us, when our children are young, we are ferrying them from one activity to the next, true? We have to take them to tennis and swimming and karate and Quran and madrasa and all of these things. And what research has shown is that I'm not talking about religious things, okay, please don't get me wrong. All of the extracurriculars that we do actually have very little predictive value of how intelligent, well-adjusted or successful your child is going to be. Very little predictive value. What has the most predictive value is how often you eat together as a family. That has been shown to, just to give you some idea, children and teenagers are less likely to get into fights, to think about suicide or be depressed, to smoke, drink or use drugs, and are more likely not to be promiscuous, to do better academically, and girls are less likely to have eating disorders. This is just straight on, data, okay? So, what about the family meal? Now, sometimes we are eating together as a family, but it's not a very pleasant experience. So what do we do? If we want our families to eat together, we need to make sure that it is a positive experience. And how do we do that? Number one, by making it a no nagging zone. So this is not a time to tell your children off for everything they've done wrong. It's not. Because what happens again is that you are building memories on the dinner table. If you use that time, oh God, they're finally in the same space as me and they're not allowed their phones, so let me tell them what all they need to do or what they haven't done, that's not the time and space. Remember, the more time you spend connecting with your children and your families, the more impact everything that you do and say will be. Does that make sense? So it's like if we were to talk about, using 1 hour for nagging, not very effective, or using 55 minutes for building communication and just building connection, and 5 minutes for nagging, because come on, as mothers, it's built in, right? Lecture is like our first go-to parenting strategy. So, and least effective, by the way. So, if we do that, it's likely to have more of an impact. Okay, so again, and it's much more pleasant, right? So use the dinner table to get to know each other, to ask questions. How was your day? Not an interview, mind you. Just, why didn't you do this well is not a bonding question, right? And why didn't you get 98 instead of 97 or whatever is not a bonding question. What is a bonding question is, what did you learn today? What excited you? What are you scared of? What are you excited about next week? Things like that. So again, the idea is the more special and sacred the family meal is, the more impactful it will be. Number 4 is obviously praying together. So if you can manage Jama Salah even, once a week, once a day, if you can, fantastic. If you can't, do du'as together. And again, du'as, we're a checklist culture, right? Extremely checklist. Like anyway, I won't say anymore. But you know what Islam tells us is, do little, but do it consistently. Do little, but do it meaningfully. But we think that we have to pray 15 du'as every day. I promise you, if you spend 5 minutes discussing one du'a and actually imbibing it in your life, it will actually have an impact, which is the purpose of the du'a, right? So, again, when we all go to majalis, and in our communities, going to places of worship is not a family activity, by the way, because we are not with each other, right? However, how do you incorporate it? By discussing what you have learned, rather than discussing the speaker or the place, discussing what you have learned and how you're going to use it, right? That can be a family bonding activity. And by the way, on that note, if we are spending hours and hours and hours at the mosque and not spending time with our family, we are not doing anyone any favors, by the way. That's not what Islam is asking of us, and there's many ahadiths to support what I'm saying, okay? So our first responsibility, like even if we're doing really good things, so I'll give you one example. So obviously I've been very preoccupied preparing for this, right? And if I did not have the support of my family and their understanding and them taking the flak at home and all of that, it wouldn't be possible for me to do what I do. It's as simple as that. So obviously there are times that I count on them and I'm not there as much as I'd like to be. However, if I would continuously do that, can you see how my emotional bank account would run very thin? So we need to make choices. Do we go to 6 majalis a day, or do we be there together with dinner as a family, right? And again, there are periods of time when we are focused on other things, and that's okay. It's not what you do some things. Sometimes it is what you do frequently that makes a difference, right? And the motto is small things often. That's what we're talking about, right? We're not talking about huge, big things. The last thing is to consult and have meetings. So again, many, many ahadiths on this. Imam Ali alayhi salam says,
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.
He who consults with the wise seeks for the lights of intelligence to be enlightened with. Like, in other words, when we consult with others, we are adding to our intelligence. It is such a beautiful way of put it. And there's no believer will become wretched by consultation, and none will gain merit through stubbornness. Okay. What this means is, what having family meetings does is, first of all, it really reduces conflict at home. When we're dealing with conflict every single day, it can really wear thin, right? If we set aside just half an hour a week to talk about problems, to literally, this is not working. This week, 3 days we were late for school. So what can we do? How does that help? Is because we're not triggered when we're talking. We are not in the middle. Like, if you're having this conversation, half your children are in the car and half are still, having breakfast, and you're trying to have this conversation, not the best time, right? Bad time, everyone's upset, all of that. If we actually, if it's a repeated issue and we're talking about it as a family, at the end of the week, can you see how we are dealing with it in a much more intentional way, and we are, being proactive rather than reactive, right? So also it really gives people, children ways to speak up. You know what's on their mind. So when the kids were young, we used to have an agenda on the in an accessible place, and if they were upset about something, they would actually go and write on as an agenda item for the family meeting. This is what I want to discuss, and it's a good idea to give them that space so you also know what's on your mind. So what all of this does is that it creates a positive environment for the family so that you're not always dealing with conflict, that you're actually focused more on bonding and you are minimizing conflict and then dealing with it in a healthy way. So again, lots of food for thought, hopefully, and inshallah, even if we can apply a little bit, including me, of what we've been talking about, we can improve ourselves.